Welcome and a big welcome to everyone to our summer edition of feminist exploration organized by the European Feminist Platform. We are getting slowly more and more people. That's very nice to see. Perhaps I'll just wait for 1 minute longer. Okay. Yeah, my name is Helen Lessing, and I'm welcoming you all to our today's edition of a feminist exploration. I'm a student, an activist, a member of the European Feminist Platform. My pronouns are she, her. The European Feminist Platform is a network in the making, and combining the work of feminist scholars, activists, and advocates to collectively fight against the backlash of the far right and create a strong bond of feminist solidarity all over Europe and beyond. Find out more about the European Feminist Platform in the link that we will post into the chat. You could see it all now, I hope. We are very happy to host this event together with the support of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation European Union and the Gunnar Werner Institute. Please note that this event will be recorded and you will be able to watch all the editions of the series on YouTube by the channel of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. We will post this link as well into the chat. This discussion will be a moderated discussion, and so you're very feel free and you're very welcome to submit any questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We will discuss the questions after the two inputs we will have today. Today we will shed light on how questions of safety and security have been radically redefined during the COVID-19 pandemic. Together with Weronika Grzebalska and Jin Haritaworn, we will explore different processes of securitization, as well as the alternative understandings of safety that are emerging in marginalized communities. During the pandemic, many states used the military and the police to provide essential services. There was a shift within the military from national security towards human security. State practices like police interventions failed to protect racialized individuals and communities, but prioritized white heteronormative middle class. We are very glad to welcome Weronika Grzebalska, a sociologist and assistant professor at the Institute of Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Science in Poland, and Jin Haritaworn, Associate Professor of Gender, Race and Environment at York University in Canada. Welcome. Weronika will explore what we can learn about the militarization of the pandemic responses through a critical feminist perspective in the context of Central and Eastern Europe. Weronika will give the first input today. Jin will ask in our today's second input, who is and who's not made safe by policing during the COVID-19 pandemic, and will discuss the alternative and transformative strategies for safety articulated by queer migrants, Black people, and people of color in the German context. And now over to you, Weronika. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now attempt to share my screen with you. Please let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me start by saying that I'm really happy to be here. And I'm really, really grateful to the European Feminist Platform for organizing an event on this very important, but I would still say under-discussed topic of militarization and securitization of non-military crisis. My short presentation today is entitled Between Militarization of COVID and Civilianization of the Military, Conducting a Feminist Audit for Central Europe. And before I move on to actually discuss the questions and the findings from my research, I wanted to briefly, let's say, set the scene. and talk about why I think it's so relevant to conduct such analysis on the militarization of non-military crisis in Central Europe in particular. Now, all of us here today, participants, panelists, coming from very different national and local contexts, I think we are all very much aware of how extensively the armed forces have been used during the recent pandemic. And they have been used in all different sorts of spheres, from border control, from medical support, disinfection, food and water distribution, all the way to the very controversial internal security tasks in some contexts. And in this sense, Central Europe, of course, is not special, because these things have been happening and the militaries have been used in all NATO states and all EU states. But I still think there is some specificity of the region I come from. And it boils down to the fact that the region has been really greatly structurally demilitarized after the Cold War. So after 1989, the armed forces across the region have been greatly reduced and professionalized. Conscription, in this sense, male conscription, has been suspended. And the militaries generally assumed a very marginal position in our states and societies. And to put it in a more kind of humorous way, it was really much easier to meet a tourist, even in provincial areas of Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland, than to meet a uniformed soldier. And the society kind of grew disinterested in the army and didn't really come in direct contact with the armed forces. And I really do believe that all of that changed almost overnight during the recent pandemic, where COVID in Central Europe really became war in rhetorical terms, and the military became everything. And here I'm paraphrasing the book title of Rosa Brooks' great book. So first and foremost, right when the lockdowns were enforced in Central Europe, populist right-wing politicians started narrating the pandemic to the public in militarized terms, as a war, as fighting, as something that demands a military plan. And here you have in this slide, I collected some snippets from media that were reporting on this grand return of the military to Central European societies. But of course, rhetoric is just one part of it. What we have seen as the pandemic situation worsened is that our militaries that, as I said, were kind of on the margins of our collective consciousness and were not used domestically to this extent, really made a return. And this led to this kind of everyday militarization of the heretofore civilian spaces. One good example is Slovakia. You have the headline in the bottom, where the army was even entrusted with a huge task of testing the whole Slovak population for COVID. And that basically means that almost every citizen came in direct contact with army personnel and actually was forced to rely on army personnel for their well-being and safety. Now, everything I'm going to talk about today is loosely based on a research article that we wrote with my dear feminist political scientist colleague from Slovakia, Zuzana Madarova, where we tried to compare the developments in Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary and understand how and why was the pandemic so militarized, the pandemic response so militarized in a region that has really been pretty much post-militarist so far. And what I'm going to attempt to do today is to actually infuse those findings with feminist curiosity and ask the question of gender and ask how this perspective and asking the question of gender about structural causes, implications of this militarization can really make us understand more. So because of the short time that we're given, I'm going to only talk about 3 main findings, and I really do hope that each of them has some significance for feminist advocacy and feminist thinking. The first finding relates to the form that military deployment took in Central Europe, where I would argue that it turned from military assistance to a type of magical military band-aid for all gendered structural vulnerabilities of our public institutions. The second finding relates to a kind of paradoxical, contradictory process that we have observed within the armed forces themselves as they took on those new domestic human security roles. namely the civilianization and regendering of the armed forces, but I'm going to describe it a bit more later. And the third finding relates to the illiberal patterns of military deployment that we observed in both Poland and Hungary, where the military was used by the government in this very instrumental way as a kind of tool of symbolic power and control of the government over vulnerable sectors and groups. So moving on to the first finding. Now, as we were analyzing the data on how many troops were used and where they were deployed as the pandemic situation was ongoing, what we found out is that what started off as just military assistance for different institutions actually, in systemic terms, turned into this military band-aid. In other words, the military was really called on to fill in all the different voids of our collective under-resilience, so to say, in many different spheres. Poland is a good example where the territorial defense forces even developed an online app to allow different public institutions like orphanages or welfare centers to apply for military assistance directly, because these spheres were so structurally underfinanced, understaffed, that they just didn't feel like it could go on without calling on the troops. And now, of course, why were the governments in Central Europe so eager to ask the military for filling in the voids? And of course, here the answer points to the structural devaluing of all those sectors of our public services that are essential for civilian resilience. So for the ability of the society to continue in a civilian, civic, democratic manner through a crisis. So by these sectors, I mean welfare, the care sector, healthcare, education, and so many more. Now, in Central Europe, as you may or may not know, civilian resilience really has huge voids. Our region is basically among the countries that spend the least on healthcare in the whole of OECD countries. The region also suffers from the huge outflow of medical and care professionals to Western Europe, which basically leads to a very small number of doctors and nurses available per 1,000 inhabitants. Poland actually has the lowest number of doctors per 1,000 inhabitants in the whole of the EU. Moreover, it's not just those civilian institutions, it's also the complete lack of alternative civil protection structures that could deliver those services and could actually help with ensuring human security during different crises, and instead of the military. So firefighters, you know, all those local citizen groups of first responders that could tackle these things in non-militarized ways, all of them have been dismantled as neoliberal economy was progressing through the region, and there were no funds and no political interest in rebuilding them. Now, what can we learn from it through this tool of feminist curiosity? Perhaps unsurprisingly, when we look at actually the gender makeup of those sectors, we will find that they are all greatly feminized. For instance, in Poland, 85% of healthcare workers are women. And it is even more so in the case of welfare and care services. And all these spheres that are so essential for civilian resilience have been basically structurally devalued after 1989, which now leads to this propensity of our right-wing governments to call on the military to patch up those vulnerabilities. Now, moving on to the second finding, so far I've talked a lot about the militarization of COVID, how the military has been permeating civilian spheres during the pandemic. But interestingly, when you look at the armed forces themselves, there seems to be a kind of contradictory, paradoxical process happening within them as they are forced to tackle new crises that are not military in nature, like a pandemic or like climate change. And they need to take up new tasks and develop new capabilities. And in the process, the armed forces themselves have been civilianizing to a large extent. And here I'm really talking about the armed forces. It would be a different story if we talked about the police, which in terms, for instance, in Hungary after 2010, after the Orban government came to power, has been militarizing to a great extent. But when it comes to the armed forces, there's actually a contradictory process. The armed forces are themselves turning from kind of machines of war fighting and border protection to actors that are supposed to ensure human security. And why it's important from a feminist perspective is because with this civilianization comes a certain gender transformation, a certain regendering of soldiering, what soldiering means, what orientations and capabilities are required. And in this sense, what we found on the ground is, for instance, that while our right-wing governments in the region were using a very militarized language to communicate the pandemic to the public, the armed forces themselves were actually using the language, surprisingly, of human security, care, and empathy. And it's not just the language, but it's also the actual on-the-ground practices. Here's a picture from Poland, where the military was, as I said, patching up all voids and vulnerabilities. And here's a picture where that shows territorial defense soldier actually taking care of children in an orphanage that was understaffed because of COVID. And that, of course, tells you that there are certain transformations within the armed forces that we can actually think of and craft some feminist interventions into them. Now, finally, this is the last slide before the conclusions. What we also found, unfortunately, were some worrisome illiberal patterns of military deployment, especially in the case of Hungary and Poland. I think most of you are aware that Hungary after 2010 and Poland after 2015 have been undergoing a sort of rolling back of liberal democratic standards and a kind of illiberal transformation where the ruling governments have hijacked all institutions and have been trying to rewrite the basic premise of what a democracy is. Interestingly, no analysis on that have been conducted on the military and the defense sector, but during the pandemic, we identified at least 2 such cases of this type of illiberal military deployment, when the military was used not as a tool of assistance and human security, but rather symbolic power and control over vulnerable sectors and populations. And one example is Hungary, where as the pandemic situation worsened and the media was reporting on how many cases of COVID are actually contracted in hospitals, state-owned hospitals, rather than outside of them, the Orban government decided to dispatch military officials and police officials to command hospitals and state-owned companies. So in other words, civilian institutions, healthcare institutions were put under government control. And watchdog activists in Hungary argue, and I actually believe that it is very much so, that the reason for that was to control the information flow outside of those institutions. Now, I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to go through Poland very quickly and go to the last slide. Now, in Poland, as you may be aware, we have had huge protests against the government and against the undemocratic abortion ban that happened in 2020. Now, recent email leaks to the press actually alert us to the fact that the government was most probably considering using the military against the protesters. Now, this did not happen to this extent. There was no violence happening. Nevertheless, the government still used hundreds of military police to protect churches from demonstrators that by that time were not interested in actually targeting churches. And this was seen by many retired military officials as this kind of symbolic tool of government power, where the government wanted to show the protesters that by going against the abortion ban, they're going against the state. So that was a very powerful illiberal message. Now, this is the last slide I have. What I wanted to say is that, when we talk about all those worrisome processes happening with regards to the militarization or securitization of non-military challenges, it's very easy to become very pessimistic and to think that we either can't do anything or that the only solution is to really change everything now. But what I want to do now is talk about two avenues of feminist advocacy that I think are still beneficial. So those two areas where I think we can still do something that's neither pessimistic passivism nor changing everything right now. One line of this feminist advocacy that I think we can still all engage in is arguing for civilian resilience. So instead of, arguing for funding our militaries more and helping our militaries deliver those tasks, we should all, I think, try and advocate for the revaluing and funding of those sectors that are essential for our resilience. The second, and of course, that also goes with rebuilding certain civil protection structures so that there are some other more civic-minded, democratic, gender-equal structures that can tackle things instead of the military. And the second, and that's the last avenue that I see as potentially beneficial for feminist advocacy, is to engage with the military itself, acknowledge that there are certain changes occurring within the military, the civilianization, regendering, and actually strengthen that while at the same time scrutinizing all those illiberal patterns of military deployment. Thank you so much, and I'm closing down the presentation.
Thank you very much, Weronika, for your very interesting presentation. Jin, I would just directly hand over to you and your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Weronika. Thanks everyone for coming and everyone who's involved in organizing. So I'm interested in this idea of the pandemic as a whitewashing device for institutions of conquest and punishment that makes them appear as institutions of care, as Weronika has said. In Germany, this whitewashing and straightwashing is happening in a context where there's endless scandals and revelations of extreme right wing. So I wouldn't call this illiberal in this context at all. Hyper-racist organizing inside of the police and military. So the growing public awareness of police racism, of course, decades-long work of anti-racist movements in particular. Well-known examples include Uri Jallo, a Black asylum seeker who died in a police cell under suspicious circumstances that he could not have inflicted upon himself. The National Socialist Underground, who for a decade targeted migrant-run businesses, killing at least 10. Police and intelligence not only failed to investigate the murders, but were actively involved in their cover-up. Next slide, please. Then there was Hanau, another racist mass murder that police, though called, did not respond to. The pandemic nearly erased the public memory of the 9 lives that were taken on 19th February 2020. Say their names: Gökhan Gültekin, Sedat Gürbüz, Sayed Nesar Hashemi, Mercedes Kirpach, Hamza Kurtovic, Willi Viorel Paun, Fatih Saraç-Olu, Ferhat Unvar, Kaloyan Belkov. Hanau gave rise to several political spaces, including the family-run Initiative 19. Februar, as well as Migrantifa, a new mass movement by and for migrant youth. Migrantifa organized in several German-speaking cities to commemorate victims of racist violence and build community in various ways, from protests to education events to food justice and other mutual aid in racialized neighborhoods. Their call on the slide for the one-year Hanau protest sums up the relationship between security police racism and civilian racism as follows. All these acts of racist killings are effects of a system where the state, intelligence, police, courts, politicians protect and support fascist networks, are a part of them even. Racism and right-wing extermination ideologies are neither the problem of a handful nor marginal events. This resistance dovetailed with the biggest mobilizations against racism historically worldwide. In Germany in June 2020 alone, tens of thousands joined Black Lives Matter protests. Happening during the pandemic, these protests were demonized by politicians and opinion makers as super spreader events that put society at risk. At the same time, they have been key sites in a transformation of safety where alternative models of collectiveness are being created that shall be the focus of my input today. At the conjuncture of pandemic and protest, it has become all too obvious that the state will not keep us all safe. While white Germans have been disproportionately targeted for safety-enhancing provisions, from the Home Office to vaccines, migrants, Black people, and people of color have been disproportionately targeted as infectious bodies and as corona rule breakers. The distinctions created by this corona racism occur along an axis of risk that is part of a larger finance capitalist logic where everything can be turned into numbers to be speculated with. R values, incidence, vaccination rates, hospital beds. While some are at risk and are prioritized for longer, safer, healthier lives, others, frequently those who bring you food during a lockdown, pose a risk to public health and safety and are prepared for punishment and neglect. This emerged from conversations that were part of my research project on the transformation of safety during COVID-19. My concept of transforming safety is inspired by earlier theories of transformative justice that prefigure safety outside of the criminal justice system. Some of the folks whose footsteps I'm in include, of course, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Jairus Dixon, Leah Lakshmi Piepschner Samra Sinha, and in Germany, our very own Vanessa Thompson, Nadia Samur, and Melanie Bratzel. In a complicated way, the transformation of safety I'm describing also vibes with Anthony Giddens' concession, however problematic, to the role of gay activists since the AIDS crisis, who brought about a transformation of intimacy, as he called it, that wider straight society then benefited from as well. I argue that something similar is going on during this pandemic, that we are in the middle of another round of transformation that is once more led by marginalized folks. Since the beginning of this year, I have conducted 20 qualitative, semi-structured interviews with activists in Berlin who are involved in spaces that are variously self-organized as queer, transgender, migrant, Black, or people of color spaces. There, COVID safety is practiced in various ways, from the creation of mutual aid networks to the subversion of the official household rules, which effectively recriminalize relationships and chosen families that do not conform to the white cis heteronormative nuclear family, to the formation of pods, bubbles, and care collectives, where queer people in particular are keeping each other safe and alive, to the organizing of anti-racist protests that reclaim public space from the conservative hygiene of the official corona rules and redefine the question of collective safety from the bottom up. Interviewees brought strong critiques of racial profiling, which, while far from new, has gained force and legitimacy during COVID-19. Mariam, who describes herself as queer, 25, and a student, and active with Migrantifa, shares her impression that the police, quote, often take the corona rules as a pretense to target people, claiming you're not wearing your mask, even though the same thing would have happened without COVID. Sanchita Basu, who works at Reach Out, the Berlin Advice Center for Victims of Violence, confirmed this by reporting that migrants and people of color who forget their masks are disproportionately targeted by fines and arrests rather than warnings, including handcuffs and other uses of disproportionate force. Mona El Omari, hi Mona, a counselor, care worker, and systemic advisor with prisoners whom I interviewed in February 2021, described racial profiling during COVID as an outflow of older policing practices that have been intensified by a new cultural context of corona racism. Next slide, please. Can we have next? Thank you. In summer 2020, it became clear who is being policed. Anecdotally, here in Berlin, the police have had a much higher presence in Kreuzberg and Neukölln than in Friedrichshain, where the Volkspark was swarming, yet policing was much more polite and discreet. COVID has put existing relations on steroids. All the media reports blaming COVID on Turkish weddings, Ramadan, and parties in Roma families, And then they put whole housing blocks under quarantine. And now they're all going skiing again in Tyrol, which was the first COVID hotspot in Europe. And yet for months they were talking about the so-called China virus. All the problems to do with policing have become intensified, and they've created new crimes too, like loitering. If a group of Black or POC kids chill in the street, they'll be profiled rather than white hipsters, so that a group of non-white people is now even more suspicious. Given the aversion to racialized folks occupying public space, it is no surprise that the protests that took place in 2020 were heavily policed too. Many interviewees called out the contradictions in cancelling the demo 6 months after Hanau due to rising numbers. Meanwhile, Querdenkers, the COVID denier organization with far-right tendencies, have regularly gathered tens of thousands under such mottos as masks off, tolerated by local governments and cheered on by the police. But while Querdenken demos fulfill the criteria of a super spreader event and contributed to the last wave of Corona last winter, according to a study by Humboldt University Berlin and Leibniz Institute Mannheim, the super spreader label was stuck instead on the Black Lives Matter protests that in Germany in June 2020 alone gathered tens of thousands across the country. 2.5 months before the cancelled Hanau demo, they were allowed to proceed, protected by the high international visibility of the global uprisings following the murder of George Floyd. I want to argue that rather than a threat, these protests have been a key site for the transformation of safety during the pandemic. They are spaces where Black people, migrants, and people of color, after a long history of patronage, are not only protesting the ways in which the state does not make us safe, but are taking the task of rebuilding safer relationships into their own hands. These demos have reclaimed public space in a political climate where even in the left, the impulse was to cancel meetings, hide at home, and repeat the conservative hygiene model of the state. They have also demonstrated, as so many of our movements before, that another world is possible, where no one is disposable, and where we remember our ancestors and elders. The footsteps they follow in were made by many movements, including disability justice, transformative justice, prison abolition, that are deeply intersectional and whose leadership has always included feminists and queer people who are Black, Indigenous, disabled, Roma, Sinti, migrant, and people of color. So I want to give just 2 examples to illustrate what this transformation of safety looks like in practice. Next slide, please. One is the safety protocol for protests by Black Lives Matter Berlin. Here, COVID safety is defined not just as wearing masks and keeping distance. It also includes racial profiling, the surveillance of mobile phones and Facebook profiles, and tear gas attacks. Pandemic policing globally has not incidentally targeted the lungs, thus using the virus as a sidekick. From May 2020 to July 2021, BLM Berlin discontinued demonstrations and other offline events following medical advice and for the protection of Black people. The other example is the safety protocol of the protest that was organized 1 year after Hanau. Mariam, who again is with Migrantifa, described its ethic in the terms of disability justice, a basic understanding, quote, of safety and access. I do this so that you can be here too. The ground roots at the protest, including physical distancing and wearing masks, at first sight resemble the corona roots of the state. At the same time, they are grounded in values, intentions, and horizons that are in tension with these roots. Next slide, please. Hamza, who identifies as Kurdish, Muslim, and non-binary trans, described the community agreement on masks as follows. Everyone at the rally had to wear a mask. That was definitely a requirement. But as organizers, we also brought extra masks to distribute to people who wanted to join the demo. For example, we had a situation where one person, whom I also didn't read as white, was walking up to our rally and found it really cool, but didn't have a mask. So we weren't going to say we're going to exclude people who don't carry masks, but want to be part of this. We paid attention to such things. In contrast to the corona rules, the call to wear masks at the rally is not grounded in isolation or punishment. The organizers are well aware that an unmasked demonstrator, in contrast to the querdenkers demonstrating the same day, would put themselves and others at risk, not just of COVID, but also of police violence. Safety here emerges as a multi-layered and socially constructed concept, where the risk is not just the virus, but also those who are meant to protect from it. This does not render safety any less real. There are clear rules. At the demo, we learned that masks are required so that many can come and no one will get arrested. However, these rules are consensual rather than punitive, expansive rather than exclusionary. They are based on the awareness that safety both creates and requires radical access and an abolitionist care that is grounded in redistribution, interdependence, and collective learning. The relationships thus created could not be further removed from the punitive and isolating logics of the state. They rehearse a future that has space for everyone. So to conclude, the critiques that I have offered in this talk at first sight resonate with libertarian arguments that the COVID regulations are an infringement of our human and constitutional rights. However, as critical legal scholars have shown, the law is not universal or abstract. Indeed, the near absolute power of the state over public and private life once more targets those who do not fall under its protection. I have illustrated this with a corona racism that constructs non-white people as infectious rule breakers who pose a risk to the properly alive and from whom society must be defended. Yet on the conjuncture of pandemic and protest, we see another round of transformation, of safety, of care, of well-being, one that may well save us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jin, for these powerful words. I would now like to invite everybody in the audience to post questions into the Q&A section for our further discussion. We have now 20 minutes to go, and any questions regarding Jin's presentation and Weronika's presentation, feel free to ask them all. Sorry. There's one question, I would just read it out directly. What is the role of transformative justice in an increasingly Islamophobic Germany during Corona, Palestine, the hijab and niqab ban? The obsession of policing and the white heteronormative intimidation by hijab and mask combination as an excuse for the white man's voyeuristic fetish. I think this question regards to you, Jin. Would you like to answer directly?
Sure. There's no way to see the question, right? There was quite a lot in there, I think.
You should be able to see it if you click on the Q&A section.
Oh, nice. Great. Oh, hi, Noor. Yeah, I mean, transformative justice in a way is the opposite to the hijab ban, right? Which in a way you could theorize as racial profiling as well, right? Because it targets female assigned and identified folks who cover their head, right? Who are Muslim, but not those who are, you know, I mean, there's all these kind of jokes about the Queen, for example, right? And I mean, a lot of folks have made arguments about masks, right? As there's a strong resonance in Germany. So one of the reasons why white Germans were so opposed to wearing masks is because there's been bans on face coverings, right? So just one example, talking to educators in our daycare, you know, the idea that the face must always be visible in order to have a connection with a child, right, is so ingrained. And I think especially in a German context. The other one being, of course, you know, an anti-left authoritarianism as well, you know, kind of covering faces at demos. So which are all examples of racial profiling by different institutions of the state, be they welfare institutions or carceral institutions. So definitely this is very gendered. So a lot of male assigned folks of color have also argued that damned if they do, damned if they don't. Wearing masks both kind of targets them for criminalization and being followed around in shops, for example, and harassed as people who are stealing. And then obviously like not wearing masks, they're the first to be picked out, right? So they would have been like racially profiled before, but now there's a hefty fine on top of it. So thank you for this really excellent question. So yes, what would an abolitionist feminist approach to the hijab look like, right? So I think that's a really good question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jin, for answering. Weronika, I would like to ask you also a question from the Q&A. Do you see a potential shift to civilization of the military as a desirable development only? Are there not risks involved with military taking over caring jobs? There have been several questions into this direction. So as well, perhaps I'll just combine them because there's another person also asking if the military might be a middle ground moving towards police. No, the civilization of the military might be a middle ground moving towards police abolition, or is the smoke screen that allows the highly overfunded military and police? So I mean, coming from different directions, but kind of also asking, yeah, is this what we really want, a change in the military? Is that what would be a solution or not?
Thank you so much for these questions. They're really thought-provoking, and they actually cut to the core of ambiguity, which unfortunately happens to be the state that any feminist explorer finds themselves in when they actually try to tackle the questions of military use, military transformations. There's this great quote from Cynthia Enloe from her book Maneuvers about militarization and militarism in the global context, where she said that militarization always leaves us with mixed feelings. So that's just to say that these are great questions, because indeed, it's kind of a double-edged sword. That's why in my conclusions, I try to say that we can't just have this kind of linear approach and only, support the civilianization of the military, but we also need to really focus on rebuilding civilian resilience. Because if we do have strong public institutions that have good funding, that have the right procedures in place, then they really will be more able to tackle different crises on their own in a more civic-minded, democratic way. That's kind of my whole idea. But at the same time, I do believe that this is kind of my own academic belief stemming from like 10 years of research on the military. It's kind of my topic. And I think that I agree with all those feminist scholars that say that maybe feminist scholars have been a little bit too pessimistic and critical about the potential of changing the military. Thinking that there's nothing that can be done with this militarized masculinity that is so ingrained there, and that basically we need to close down the militaries and create some alternative structures. And I think it's a great thing to work towards, but maybe we have underestimated the potential of the military to transform itself. But I think the questions that I got are also coming from this paradox of like this conflation of the military and the police. Because my whole presentation was about the military use, right? Not the police use. And this would be a completely different picture. And I'm extremely happy to be able to learn from Jin's presentation. I had no idea that it was that bad in Germany. But at the same time, I think that what we're seeing now is a kind of really weird time when the police is militarizing very much so in terms of equipment, in terms of how they actually control the population, how they act in the civilian spheres, while the military is actually seems to be going in the other direction. More along what Mary Kaldor has been proposing for over 20 years, the British-Hungarian scholar, who wrote about how, you know, we need to turn armies into actors of human security. And even at that time, many people said that it's too utopian and it can't be done. But I think we see that it's actually going in that direction, but of course can always be reversed. So yeah, that's how I would answer it without a very concluding remark, simply because I think it's very ambiguous, but ambiguity invites us to find effective interventions rather than to just say, oh, it's done. And coming from Central Europe, I'm all for hoping that we can still do something rather than just say that it's all hopeless.
Thank you, Weronika. Jin, would you like to respond to that directly?
Sure. Yeah, my question, I like this idea of a feminist curiosity and following things around. I'd like to also bring an anti-racist curiosity to this question, right? And I was intrigued by your suggestion, you know, that these institutions of punishment and conquest are like whitewashing themselves, right? And I guess in a West European context, especially, you can't ignore, you know, that the military was always an institution of conquest, right? And here the shift that is happening, you're talking about, you know, shift from demilitarization to remilitarization is a remilitarization of a Germanness that needs to no longer be ashamed of, you know, the imperialism, colonialism, and genocide, right, of the Nazi period. So kind of similar things have been happening here. And this is not, you know, caveat, this is not my area, right? But obviously the Bundeswehr has also been in the nursing homes, right? Has also been testing children in the daycares and all of that. But I think, you know, we need to ask ourselves, like, what else is happening at the same time? And by that, I mean, obviously, the war in Afghanistan, right, for example, but also the scandals, the never-ending scandals about police, and to me, the two institutions are actually very linked, right? The internal and the external enemies, which are often kind of overlapping, right? Through a refugee system, through a migration system. But, you know, apart from the kind of war on terror that Noor just mentioned, right? And the kind of, you know, transformation of the German army into this kind of great rescue, you know, institution. And I've written about that a little bit in my work on homo-nationalism and queer necropolitics, you know, how the whole inclusion of gay and trans soldiers, you know, and obviously female soldiers in that project also serves to care wash the military into a caring institution. But in the context of Corona, I'm also interested in who is the subject of care, right? Who is deserving of care, right? So when the military go into nursing homes and all the media are there, who are the old people who are being vaccinated, for example, you know? So in the priority group 1, the above 80-year-olds, the Ärztezeitung, the physicians newspaper recently reported that actually very few people of color were, you know, even though they were over 80, were actually vaccinated, right? And similarly, the media images of the nursing homes, of these caring images that you've also just shared, Weronika, were almost exclusively, I do not remember seeing a single person of color, right? Among these nostalgic images of elderly people. And people of color, you know, have been excluded from, you know, protection from the virus in these ways, but also have been scapegoated as infectious rule breakers, right? So there's this thing happening with care that I'm curious about, you know, that both the punishing institutions are involved in, but also the kind of more classic institutions of the welfare state, right? So medical racism in the healthcare system, right, for example, or, you know, the employment sector, who's allowed to be in the home office, who isn't.
Thank you. There's a question to you, Weronika, which kind of links to that what Jin already said. How would already marginalized and over-police controlled communities would profit from a kind of military when the military's job would be upholding of the very same structures that marginalized in the first place. Would you like to answer to that?
Sure. First of all, I think what we're kind of missing here is like, there's this kind of very narrow focus on the military as this evil kernel that produces, or police as this evil kernel that produces all the systemic oppression and violence, and sociologically, it's just doesn't hold together. And what I tried to do in this presentation was to actually show the structural causes, the deeply ingrained socioeconomic causes for why our societies are relying on the military in the first place. So the point was to shift the focus from just, you know, the easy scrutinizing of the bad military towards scrutinizing socioeconomic reasons for why certain groups are where they are, for why our institutions are not resilient, and for why the military needs to be called in order to, in this context, basically uphold them. And this was kind of the main point for that. And in this sense, in no way, actually the whole article we wrote with Susanna was a critique of the militarization of the pandemic, but we wanted critique to not be an easy cop-out, you know, just saying military bad. We wanted the critique to go down into the structural socioeconomic causes of this and criticize them as the root cause of this situation. And then from that followed the recommendation that if we really want to make sure that these situations don't happen and that different minority communities are more protected, then we need to tackle those structural things in the first place. And that can be done within this new framework of resilience that is kind of becoming more and more fashionable across different spheres. Now, with regards to people of color and their marginalization and like police brutality, I think the point is that, you know, Central Europe is completely different in the sense in that we don't really have such diverse communities in terms of race. And in this sense, I think the only example I can think of, and I really wish my co-author was here because she really knows so much about it and wrote a whole article about it, is the case of the quarantining of Roma settlements in Slovakia. This is what I can think of really clearly when I think of these topics that you raised as a good example, where overnight Roma settlements have been closed down without notice by the military. And Roma people were basically like policed in this sense as this potential source of the disease. Now, of course, in this sense, I completely agree with everything that Jin said, so there's no need to actually repeat that. But what I wanted to add is that when I actually interviewed certain Slovak military officials who were on the ground, and this is something that would need to be checked. I'm sharing it as an anecdote because, you know, I haven't checked state documents, but what they told me is that the main rationale, again, for involving the military in this was because civilian healthcare professionals refused to work in those conditions in a civilian manner because they were so afraid of contracting COVID. So then again, you know, just having this narrow tunnel vision of how terrible it is that the military went there, I agree, we should do it in a civilian manner. But then you actually see the kind of deeper reasons why this might be. And these reasons point to, again, the fact that people just feel so scared because our states are so kind of have been so underfunding structurally healthcare and so on. And they just were scared, and the military cannot refuse, right? But even those military officials are interviewed said that they would rather that there be a civic protection unit that would do it and not them. So just leaving it as a kind of food for thought about how we can engage with these questions with kind of a more holistic idea that what's happening has structural causes and we need to tackle them.
Thank you very much, Weronika. But does it, I'm referring now directly again, does this actually, like the healthcare, people in the healthcare system didn't want to go into the Roma settlements I mean, this means there's like this over racist atmosphere. So is that like visible? And like, is there anybody doing something against it? I mean, this is now a very concrete question if you want to answer to that, or I will also pick another one in a.
Yeah, I don't really feel that knowledgeable on the concrete Slovak context. I will be super happy to post 2 articles that I know of, written by feminist scholars from the CEE region. And they certainly will describe it better. So I just don't want to talk about something that I haven't studied to this extent.
Definitely. Yeah, you're very welcome to share it in the chat. I really like that the two of you brought like the feminist curiosity, and Jin, you brought in the anti-racist, decolonist curiosity together, and having an approach which is probably needed for this huge discussion. I mean, we are still within a pandemic, and safety is the thing everybody somehow wants, but at the same time, it is put through in a very, very different ways, as the two of you showed very clearly on, and how it is targeted different, how people are targeted different within this safety responses. Because we're now slowly coming to an end, I wanted to ask you like one, if you, I don't know, if you could put it into one sentence, this would be wonderful. What will be your call for action? Because our the event is called the Feminist Exploration, and we kind of want to go out of the event with somehow a call for action. I mean, it is difficult within this topic to put that into something very short, but if you would like to try, yeah, what would be your call for action? Jin, perhaps you want to start?
Sure. So I'm very interested, and probably similar to you, Weronika, you kind of mentioned a few similar things. I'm interested in expanding spaces of care. And those can be in the kind of traditional places where we've been looking for them, you know, so the established social movements. Some people do amazing work within the state and definitely holding the state accountable. So I don't think you can, you know, by all fairness, look at Black Lives Matter protests and look at Hanau demos and say people are abandoning the state. People are spending a lot of energy on trying to hold the state accountable and change the state, but are also spending energy on each other, right? So, and that might be like small spaces, like my book, Queer Lovers and Hateful Others, focused on kitchen tables, because at the time, that was the only space that was available to people who were regularly run over on intersections, right, of feminism versus anti-racism, of, you know, gender studies versus decolonial studies. So, and obviously the challenge is to expand spaces, right, and to kind of recognize and respect when change happens. So I think thousands taking to the street and risking their lives during a pandemic in a way that really models attention to safety, you know, from the kind of like mainstream ways, like pretty individualized, you know, ways that the state has taught us to keep our distance, you know, like be individuals and just protect ourselves, stay home, right? But also have taught us to reclaim the streets, you know, to not give up on public space, right? I find that pretty inspiring. And again, I want to argue that this transformation of safety that is occurring right now is challenging in so many ways, from the neoliberal defunding that we've talked about, right? To the foundations of Western nation states, where the camp and the settlement, the Roma settlement, is not the exception, but is actually the place that we need to start from, right? So I'm excited about all these things that are happening right now, and look forward to further conversation.
Thank you very much for these very inspiring words. Weronika, what is your call for action?
Yes, so I'll be repeating myself. I'm sorry for that, but it's what I put on the last slide of, with the conclusions, that my call for action would be to really, so to say, this shouldn't probably say it in with this metaphor, but ironically, gather the feminist troops to really advocate for rebuilding civilian resilience, which is, someone asked in the question and answer box, which is basically the capacity of our civilian institutions, our society as such, to go through a crisis, but transform through a crisis to be better. And this would, for me, mean, you know, in different contexts, there would be different vulnerabilities, but I think we can all agree that after the Washington Consensus, our main vulnerability is the kind of neoliberal model, which has stripped our civilian institutions of funds, which have put more unpaid work on those more underprivileged. And in this sense, there will be no resilience if we don't tackle that. And that's what I kind of tried to show with the example of Central Europe, which is maybe one of the most dire examples of this neoliberal dismantling of resilience that we have in the EU, by showing how, you know, the healthcare, welfare, care sectors have been basically completely defunded and have been running on fumes, sustained only by their mostly female workers. And that this is something that I believe is the #1 call for action, that, you know, while there will be many militarists out there who will say that the military did great during COVID and we need to fund it more and give it more tasks. The point is to say, no, we need to first and foremost build civilian resilience and also make sure that it is infused with this more democratic and civic spirit. So that, you know, that's one part, and the other small sub part of it would be something that I advocate for in Poland. I don't know if it would apply everywhere. I do believe that across Europe, such structures exist at this point, but to kind of rebuild civic protection structures, groups of local citizens that can have a very civic-minded ethos, that can basically assist themselves and don't need to call on the police or the military. And I know for sure that such structures have been functioning in Italy during COVID. I listened to one presentation and I see that out of the two options, this is certainly a better one, because it also seems to me like these groups, since they would be made up from local citizens, they wouldn't be seen as threatening and they wouldn't be really acting from this position of control. But of course, the problem is who will join these groups, and that's what I will leave for later. Here's the necessity to really make sure that they have a civic-minded ethos, and that they can therefore be joined by a variety of groups in our society, not just men, not just those who believe in a strong state, but everyone. But I would say public opinion polls, at least in my country, show that these types of groups would have a much more diverse makeup than the military itself. So hopefully this is a task for the future.
Thank you very much to the both of you. This was a very, very dense discussion and your presentation. So everybody check out the YouTube link again so you can rewatch the whole discussion, because there was so much in it. Yeah, we can learn more about it. So thank you very much to you, Weronika Grzebalska, and to you, Jin Haritaworn. This was a really eye-opening discussion. Also, big thanks to everybody behind the scenes. There will be more feminist explorations during the course of this year, so stay tuned. And I wish you all a lovely day and all the best, and goodbye. Thank you for joining today.